The rustle of silk was the first sound to break the veil of sleep, a soft whisper against the heavy silence of early morning. It was followed by the low, unclear murmur of eunuch guards standing just beyond the door, their voices a steady hum that seemed to shake through the very walls. The air in the small room was thick and suffocating, filled with the sweet smoky scent of costly incense and the strong perfume of orange blossoms drifting in from the palace gardens below. It was a smell meant to show wealth, but to the small girl waking on a thin mat, it only smelled of captivity. She was Theodora, 6 years old, and this was the golden cage of the Hippodrome's faction house in Constantinople. The year was 500 AD, and the great city outside these walls was a crowded, chaotic heart of an empire. But within this small room given to the family of a performer, the world was shaped by silken whispers and the constant watch of the greens. A cold dread, heavy and familiar, sank in her belly the moment her eyes opened. It was the fear that had settled 3 days earlier, a hard stone of certainty that had not left her since. Her father, Akasis, was gone, the strong man who smelled of hay and animals, who could calm her angry bear with a low word and steady hand, had been taken by a fever that burned through him with terrifying speed. His absence was a void that filled the room, stronger than the insect. From the larger room beyond, she could hear the muffled, broken sounds of her mother's crying, a sound becoming as constant as the guards' murmurs. Her 2 older sisters were still asleep, their bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort. Theodora lay perfectly still, listening. She listened to the sounds of the complex waking to life, the distant roar of a caged animal, the clatter of buckets, the shouts of men preparing for another day of shows. All of it went on, completely uncaring of the small collapse that had struck their lives. The richness of their surroundings felt like a cruel joke. The silk curtains, the polished mosaic floor, the glimpse of trimmed gardens, they were not hers. They belonged to the green faction. They were the signs of a patronage that was weak, uncertain, and now with her father's death almost surely taken away. This room, this life, stood alone, and the cost had just come due. The fear was not only of hunger but of the street, of being thrown from this golden cage into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the city. Her mother and sisters with her, with nothing and no one to help them. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her small shoulders, trying to hide from the dawn and the terrible choices it would press upon her family. The cage, for all its gold, had never felt so much like a prison. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and struggle, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider pressing that like button and subscribing for more stories like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it amazing that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. 3 days of quiet dread ended in a frantic, hopeless ritual. Theodora's mother moved through their small chamber with nervous energy, her hands shaking as she laid out their finest clothes. The garments, once bright with the green faction's colors, were now faded and worn, the seams stretched and frayed. Each stitch was a sign of a comfort that had always been borrowed, each patch a mark of a life lived on the very edge of ruin. The air, still thick with the cloying scent of blossoms and incense, now also carried the sharp metallic tang of fear. Her mother's fingers were cold as they fastened the tiny buttons at the back of Theodora's neck. The touch was hurried, desperate, a stark contrast to the gentle, sure hands that had cared for them just a week before. Theodora stood rigidly, watching her sisters being similarly prepared. Their young faces were pale and confused, their eyes wide with a fear they could not name but deeply felt. They were being dressed for a sacrifice, adorned for an appeal to gods who were already known to be capricious and cruel. With a final trembling sigh, their mother gathered them, herding them like fragile, precious lambs. She did not speak, her own voice seemingly locked behind a wall of terror. She merely clutched the smallest child's hand and led the way out of the room, down the cool, shadowed corridors of the faction complex. The usual sounds of the hippodrome, the distant roar of the crowd, the bellow of caged animals were muted today, replaced by the ominous echo of their own footsteps on the marble floor. They were ushered into a long, opulent hall where the leaders of the Green faction lounged on cushioned couches. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like gold, a stark contrast to the heavy gloom that settled over Theodora's family. The men were arrayed in silks far richer than their own, their fingers heavy with rings, their faces smooth and well-fed. They looked up as the small, shabby procession entered, their expressions not of curiosity, but of mild, bored annoyance at the interruption. Theodora's mother stepped forward, her voice a fragile, broken thing that cracked in the vast space. She began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rushed, pleading torrent. She spoke of her dead husband, of his years of loyal service, of his skill with the beasts that brought the Green's glory and coin. She begged not for charity, but for the right for another to take his place, for the meager but life-sustaining wages that would keep his children from starvation. Her voice, once strong and melodic, was now a tremulous whisper, each word a humiliating surrender of dignity. The men listened, but did not hear. Their faces were immovable masks of indifference. One, a man with a carefully trimmed beard and eyes that held no warmth, examined the nails of one hand as she spoke. Another swirled wine in his cup, his gaze drifting over the heads of the children as if they were merely pillars in the room. The plea for their survival was nothing more than an inconvenient noise. When her mother's voice finally faltered into a choked silence, the man with the bored eyes flicked his wrist. It was a tiny, effortless gesture, a dismissive wave of a hand that carried the weight of a death sentence. It meant nothing. It meant destitution. A guard stepped forward not to escort them, but to shove them roughly back toward the door. The sound that followed them out was not one of silence or pity, but of laughter. It was a cold, derisive sound that echoed in the hall, chasing them into the bright, dusty street outside. The brilliant Constantinople sun was a shocking assault after the dim hall, and the laughter seemed to bake into the stones beneath their feet, a permanent stain of their humiliation. They stood blinking in the sudden light, their fine threadbare clothes now feeling like a cruel joke. The dust of the street was already settling on them, the first layer of their new desperate reality. The dust clung to their threadbare tunics, a gritty testament to their sudden fall from grace. The laughter from the Green faction hall still seemed to ring in Theodora's ears, a cruel echo that drowned out the normal clamor of the city. Her mother stood frozen for a long moment, her shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. The bright sun illuminated the tear tracks cutting through the dust on her cheeks. Then a new, desperate resolve hardened her features. Her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, scanned the bustling avenue before settling on the distant, imposing complex that housed their rival. Without a word, she grabbed Theodora's hand and those of her sisters. Her grip, suddenly fierce, pulled them forward as she began to march them toward the Blue faction's headquarters. The walk was a blur of hostile glances and jostling crowds. The Blues complex was a mirror image of the Greens in its opulence, but the air felt different, sharper, colder. The guards at the entrance wore the same colors of sky and sea, but their eyes held a calculating keenness rather than bored indifference. They were admitted not into a grand hall but a smaller, darker chamber, where a single man sat behind a heavy table littered with scrolls and ledger. He was the leader of the Blues, a man whose reputation for cold pragmatism was as well known as the rings that adorned every one of his fingers, glinting dully in the lamplight. His gaze swept over them as they entered, not lingering on the mother's desperate face or the younger girl's frightened ones, but settling on Theodora. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, and they held no pity. Only a slow, meticulous assessment. He looked her over as a merchant might assess a new piece of livestock, weighing potential value against immediate cost. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint scratch of a stylus from a scribe in the corner. Theodora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. This was not a plea for mercy. It was a transaction, and they were the goods on offer. After what felt like an eternity, the man gave a single, slow nod. He agreed to take them. He would provide shelter, food, and the protection of the blue faction. The words were spoken in a flat, businesslike tone, devoid of any compassion. The price was not stated in coin or service, but it hung in the air between them, thick and unmistakable. It was a lifetime of unquestioning loyalty, a debt that would never be fully paid, and for Theodora, the one he had looked at longest, it was a future no longer her own, a life that would be shaped and bent to the whims of these powerful, ruthless men. A sound ripped from her mother's throat, a ragged gasp of pure, unadulterated relief. She clutched her daughters to her, her face transforming, the lines of terror smoothing into something beatific and grateful. She saw salvation. But Theodora, staring at the man's cold, ringed hands, felt only the heavy weight of new chains settling around her soul. The relief on her mother's face was the most painful thing she had ever seen, a radiant portrait of deliverance that stood in stark, terrible contrast to the invisible cage whose door had just slammed shut behind them. By age 10, the roar of the hippodrome was the only lullaby Theodora knew. A fickle, thundering god, whose moods dictated the rhythm of her life. The dust of the arena floor, kicked up by chariots and the pounding feet of dancers, had permanently settled in her lungs, a gritty reminder that her world was one of spectacle, not substance. The cold-eyed leader of the Blues had kept his word, providing shelter and sustenance, but the currency of their survival was performance. Theodora was not sent to a tutor to learn her letters, or to a scribe to study account. Her classroom was the sand-strewn practice yard behind the faction complex. Her teachers were hardened performers whose own glory days were fading memories. Her body became an instrument, honed and disciplined through hours of relentless practice. She learned to dance, not the graceful, measured steps of a noble woman, but the wild, acrobatic whirls that could captivate a crowd of thousands. Her muscles ached with the memory of holding impossible poses. Her feet grew tough and calloused from the rough ground. She learned to project her voice, a skill more vital than any weapon, until she could pitch it to cut through the din of the mob and reach the very highest, cheapest seats, where the air was thin and the spectators most jaded. It was a voice that could whisper a secret to the front row or declare a proclamation to the gods. She learned the subtle arts of mimicry, studying the powerful senators and officials who frequented the games. In the safety of the practice yard, she perfected the pompous strut of one, the oily, ingratiating smile of another, the way a third would stroke his beard in feigned contemplation. These were not just parlor tricks. They were lessons in the anatomy of power. Taught through ridicule, she learned that a smile delivered at the right moment could disarm a critic or ensnare a patron. A turned back, executed with just the right blend of hurt and defiance, could elicit roars of support from the crowd, and a single well-placed tear, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek, was worth a purse full of copper coins, a lesson in the brutal economy of emotion. The crowd's adoration was a heady wine, but its favor was as transient as a shadow. One day they would chant her name until the very stones of the hippodrome seemed to vibrate with it. The next they might pelt her with rotten fruit if her performance lacked its usual fire. She learned to read their mood like a sailor reads the sea, to sense the moment a joke would land, and when a tragic turn would bring a collective gasp. This roaring, faceless entity was her keeper, her judge, and her only means of survival. It gave her bread and occasionally glory. It could just as quickly take it all away, leaving her with nothing but the echo of its indifference. In the gilded cage of the arena, Theodora was learning to become its most captivating and most dangerous creature. At 16, Theodora commanded the stage with a presence that seemed to draw all light and sound toward her. Her beauty was no longer that of a child, but sharpened into something formidable. High cheekbones dusted with gold, eyes that could flash with laughter or freeze with disdain, a voice that could weave spells of comedy or tragedy with equal skill. The crowd adored her, their roars of physical force that washed over her each night. She was a star in the firmament of Constantinople's entertainment, her name whispered in taverns and shouted from the tiers of the hippodrome. But the adoration was a thin veneer over a reality that festered beneath. For every bouquet thrown at her feet, there was the leering gaze of a wealthy patron. For every cheer, the casual brush of a hand that claimed ownership of her person. The powerful men who filled the best seats saw her not as an artist, but as a temporary diversion, a beautiful object to be admired, used and discarded. Coins were tossed onto the stage not in appreciation but as payment for a fantasy they believed they had purchased. Each performance ended not with a bow but with the slow, humiliating retreat from the lights back into the shadows, where her value was tallied and her humanity dismissed. The silks she wore felt like costumes for a play she had never agreed to star in, and the applause rang hollow in ears that had learned to hear the contempt beneath the noise. Then came Hellas. He was not like the others who clamored for her attention in the grimy aftermath of a He was a provincial governor from the North African Pentapolis, a man of actual rank and responsibility, his bearing stiff with the authority of office rather than the indolence of inherited wealth. He did not throw coin. He watched her performances with a quiet, intense focus, and when he finally approached her, it was not in the chaotic scrum of admirers, but in a moment of calculated privacy. His proposal was not one of coins for a night, but of a title for a lifetime. He offered her not the transient glow of the stage lights, but the steady sun of a new land. He asked her to leave the hippodrome, the factions, the dust, and the humiliation of Constantinople, and to accompany him to Pentapolis as his acknowledged companion. The words hung in the air, shimmering with the promise of legitimacy. It was not love he offered. She was too shrewd to believe in such fables, but it was a chance to step out from under the weight of her past, to shed the skin of the actress and become something else entirely, a respected woman at the side of a powerful man. The thought was a clean, sharp breath in lungs that had been choked with the incense and sweat of the arena for a decade. It felt like a pardon. It felt like a door swinging open on a future she had not dared to imagine. Without hesitation, her heart pounding not with fear but with wild, reckless hope, Theodora took it. She turned her back on the only world she had ever known and walked toward the waiting ship without a single glance behind. The sea voyage to Africa was a trial of endurance, a relentless swaying that mirrored the instability of her newfound position. The ship, a sturdy merchant vessel, carved through waves that rose like dark liquid mountains before crashing into valleys of frothing wine. The air, once thick with the familiar scents of Constantinople, incense, humanity, the sea thinned into something salt-scoured and foreign. For a time, the novelty of the journey and the respect afforded to her as Hecebalus' companion acted as a balm. She stood at the rail beside him, the wind whipping her hair, watching the distant coastline of Libya emerge from the haze, a line of ochre and dull green beneath a blinding sky. In the provincial capital of Pentapolis, she was treated with a deference she had never known. Her every need was attended to by silent servants. She walked through sun-baked courtyards and dined in rooms open to the stars, and for a fleeting season the gilded cage of her past felt truly broken. But governors are recalled as easily as they are appointed, and the message from Constantinople, when it arrived, was terse and final. Hecebalus' face, usually a mask of composed authority, tightened into lines of cold pragmatism. The preparations for departure were swift, efficient, and utterly excluded her. The silks and trinkets he had bestowed upon her were packed away not in her chests, but in his. The servants who had once bowed now averted their eyes. The promise of a new life curdled into the familiar taste of transaction, and she understood with a sinking certainty that her value had been spent. He left her on the docks of Alexandria as one might discard an empty wineskin. The great harbor was a chaos of shouting stevedores, groaning ropes, and the shriek of gulls. The ship that had carried her to this moment was being made ready to carry him away, its sails beginning to belly with a wind that smelled of home. His home. He did not look back as he crossed the gangplank. There was no final word, no coin pressed into her palm, not even the courtesy of a lie. He simply walked onto the deck and became part of the ship, a figure receding into the machinery of his own ambition. The gangplank was hauled away, the ropes cast off, and the vessel began to glide toward the open sea, leaving her standing alone on the sun-bleached planks. The heat of the Egyptian sun descended upon her then, a physical weight that felt less like warmth and more like judgment. It pressed down on her bare head, baked the wood beneath her thin sandals, and reflected off the white walls of the city in a brutal, blinding glare. She was utterly alone. 1,000 miles of hostile sea separated her from the only place she had ever known, and the language swirling around her was a cacophony of alien sounds. The trade she had, the practiced smile, the seductive dance, the perfectly timed tear, was the very one she had sworn to leave behind on the stages of Constantinople. It was the only currency she possessed, and the knowledge of it was a humiliation deeper than any she had ever faced on the boards of the Hippodrome. The ship became a speck on the horizon, and Theodora was left with nothing but the crushing weight of the sun and the vast, indifferent expanse of the sea. The son of Alexandria, once a merciless judge, became a witness to a slow and desperate metamorphosis. Hunger was a sharper master than any faction leader, and it drove Theodora through the labyrinthine streets of the city, a ghost haunting the shadows of its great colonnades and bustling markets. She moved through the crowds like a whisper, her once proud posture bent under the weight of survival. The skills that had made her a star of the Hippodrome, the ability to read a crowd, to project an aura, to command attention, were now bent to a darker, more urgent purpose, the art of invisibility. She learned which bakeries might spare a stale crust at closing, which merchant stalls were left poorly guarded, which alleyways offered a few hours of uneasy shelter. The applause of the mob was replaced by the knowing emptiness in her belly, a far more honest critic. Her wandering feet, guided by a despair she had never known, eventually led her to the steps of a small, unassuming chapel tucked away from the city's grand thoroughfare. It was a place of refuge for the monophysites, Christians who believed in the single divine nature of Christ, a doctrine at odds with the official orthodoxy of Constantinople. Exhausted, hollowed out, she slipped inside, drawn not by piety, but by the promise of shade and the scent of charity. Simple bread and cheap wine offered to the wretched. She took the offered sustenance with trembling hands, her head bowed not in prayer but in shame. But as she lingered in the cool, dim stillness, something unexpected happened. The words of the patriarch, spoken in sonorous, passionate Greek, began to seep past her hunger and her humiliation. They spoke not of a distant, judgmental God, but of a Christ who suffered, who was cast out and despised, who understood the agony of the abandoned. They spoke of a faith that was itself persecuted, a community bound not by power but by shared struggle and defiance. It was a theology of the marginalized, and it found a deep, resonant chord within her. In the dust of this foreign chapel, amidst the murmured prayers of the outcast, Theodora found not just solace, but a framework for her rage. Her conversion was not a gentle awakening of the spirit, but a fierce and calculated realignment of her soul. The stagecraft of her old life was reborn as a new identity, that of a penitent, a fervent convert, a woman saved not by man but by God. She offered her services to the patriarchs, not as an actress but as a scribe, a messenger, a discreet pair of eyes and ears. Her intellect, long applied only to comedy and mimicry, now hungrily absorbed the intricate webs of theology and power. She learned how doctrine swayed emperors, how patriarchs manipulated politics, how the church and state were not separate entities, but a single coiling serpent of influence. She listened to the whispered strategies in the chapel's back rooms, her mind filing away every name, every grievance, every ambition. The hunger in her belly was gradually replaced by a different, colder hunger, a thirst for influence, for security, for a power that could never be abandoned on a dime. In the crucible of Alexandria, a new ambition was being forged within her, tempered in the fires of betrayal and faith, and it was infinitely harder than the old. The journey back to Constantinople was a pilgrimage of a different kind. The ship that carried her across the wine-dark sea was no governor's vessel, but a humble merchant cog, its timbers groaning with the weight of grain and oil, and one woman's iron resolve. Theodora stood at the rail, not as a companion to power, but as its student, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the fabled city would rise. The salt spray on her face felt like a baptism, washing away the last remnants of the actress, the mistress, the abandoned woman. She was returning not to the life she had fled, but to a stage of her own meticulous design. The year was 522 AD, and the woman who disembarked onto the familiar, frenetic docks of the Golden Horn was a creature entirely remade from the one who had left them. She did not seek the noisy, garish compound of the Blue faction, nor any place that remembered the girl from the Hippodrome. Instead, with a few coins carefully saved from her work with the Alexandrian patriarchs, she secured a small, unadorned house, tucked into a warren of streets that climbed the hill toward the great palace. Its single room was whitewashed and bare, its only luxury a sliver of a view between taller buildings, a glimpse of the palace's soaring domes and the imperial standard snapping in the breeze. It was a calculated choice. Humility was her new costume, and she wore it with the precision of a master performer. In the center of that sparse room, she placed a spindle and a distaff. Each morning, as the city awoke to the clamor of commerce and politics, Theodora would seat herself by the small window and take up the wool. Her hands, once trained for the fluid gestures of dance and the delicate application of cosmetics, now learned the repetitive, rough rhythm of spinning. The coarse fibers chafed her palms, her daily penance and a constant reminder of her chosen path. She would work for hours, the spindle whirring, her body bowed in a posture of industry and piety. To any who might glance her way, a servant from the palace, a passing priest, a curious neighbor, she was a picture of respectable penitence, a woman who had turned her back on a sinful past to embrace a life of humble, virtuous toil. But her eyes, when she lifted them from her work, were not those of a penitent lost in prayer. They were the eyes of a strategist, missing nothing. She noted the comings and goings of palace officials, memorized the schedules of the guards, observed which senators favored which routes. The whirring of the spindle was the sound of her patience, a measured and relentless ticking as she waited. She had placed herself in the shadow of power, a spider at the edge of the great web, spinning her own quiet thread. She was a respectable, unthreatening figure, a woman with a story of redemption that would pique the interest of the devout and the powerful. She was waiting with the absolute certainty of a predator for the right moment to be seen by the right eye. The wool between her fingers was not just thread. It was the first strand of the rope she would use to climb back into the world, and this time, she would not let go. The moment arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet, rhythmic cadence of imperial footsteps on the cobbled street outside her door. Justinian, nephew to the Emperor Justin, was a man whose passage through the city was marked by a wake of respectful silence and averted gaze. His reputation preceded him like a cold draft, a man of formidable intellect, severe in his demeanor, utterly consumed by the dry tinder of law and administration. Theodora heard the approach before she saw it, the measured tread of guards and the soft murmur of advice. She did not rush to the window. She remained seated by her spindle, her hands stilling their work, her back straightening imperceptibly. This was the convergence she had engineered through months of patient waiting. As his shadow fell across her threshold, she lifted her gaze. It was not the demure downward glance of a humble spinner, nor the bold, inviting look of the actress she had been. It was a look of direct, unflinching assessment. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, the carefully constructed distance between the imperial nephew and the woman at the spinning wheel dissolved. He was accustomed to eyes that dropped in fear or narrowed in calculation. He was not accustomed to being seen, truly seen by a woman who showed not a flicker of intimidation. He paused. The procession behind him stuttered to an awkward halt. The silence stretched thick and charged. Without rising, without a hint of supplication in her posture, Theodora spoke. Her voice, trained to carry to the highest tiers of the Hippodrome, was low and clear, devoid of theatrical flourish. She did not compliment him or beg for alms. Instead, she challenged. She referenced a recent edict, a point of law regarding property rights that had been debated in the Senate, and she offered a counter-argument. It was not the argument of a scholar quoting dusty scrolls, but that of a practical mind that understood how laws truly landed on the lives of the people they governed. She spoke of unintended consequences, of loopholes that would benefit only the already powerful, of a more equitable interpretation. Justinian stood utterly still, his severe face a mask of shock that slowly gave way to intense, rapt fascination. Here was no sycophant, no pretty diversion. Here was a mind sharp and unafraid, engaging with him on the only ground he truly respected, the intricate, brutal chessboard of jurisprudence. He saw the intelligence burning in her eyes, the confidence in her bearing that had nothing to do with station or birthright. She debated him not as an inferior but as an equal. Her words precise, her logic impeccable. The dusty street, the watching guards, the whirring of time itself, all seemed to fade away. There was only the woman in the simple house, and the complex, brilliant argument she was weaving. A tapestry far more compelling than any wool. He was a man who had mastered the world through reason, and he found himself utterly captivated by a woman unafraid to wield her own. Meeting him as an equal, Justinian's obsession became a force of nature, a tectonic pressure building beneath the placid surface of imperial politics. His mind, so disciplined in dissecting legal codes and administrative minutiae, was now fixed on a single, seemingly insurmountable obstacle, an ancient, dusty statute from the time of Augustus. The law was a relic, a fossilized piece of morality, that forbade any man of senatorial rank from marrying an actress or a prostitute, branding such a union a stain upon the dignity of Rome itself. To the patricians of Constantinople, it was a convenient barrier, a way to keep bloodlines pure and the social order intact. To Justinian, it was an absurdity, an arbitrary wall standing between him and the only woman whose intellect matched his own, whose spirit refused to be categorized or contained. He moved with a relentless surgical precision that left the old guard of the Senate bewildered and uneasy. The corridors of the great palace hummed with a new, urgent energy, as scribes and lawyers, under his exacting direction, were set to work. Scrolls of law were unfurled across marble tables, their ancient Greek and Latin texts scrutinized, not for wisdom but for weakness. Justinian's arguments were not emotional pleas, they were legal demolitions, expertly crafted to isolate the old statute as an archaic anomaly, a contradiction within the broader body of Roman law that upheld the emperor's right to regulate social order for the good of the state. He framed it not as a personal desire, but as a necessary modernization, an act of imperial clemency and pragmatic reform. His formidable will was brought to bear upon his uncle, the Emperor Justin, a man whose advanced age and fading health made him putty in the hands of his ambitious, fiercely determined nephew. In the hushed, incense-heavy privacy of the imperial chambers, Justinian presented his case. He spoke of stability, of the strength that would come from an emperor united with a woman of the people, a symbol of a new, inclusive Rome. He spoke of Theodora's piety, her reformed character, her sharp mind, all qualities he had meticulously documented and promoted. The old emperor, weary and trusting his nephew's formidable judgment, assented. His hand, guided by Justinian's, signed the decree. In the year 505 AD, the ancient law was not merely overlooked, it was obliterated. A new statute was proclaimed throughout the empire, a law that bore no grand impersonal title, but a name that echoed through the forums and basilicas with shocking intimacy. The law of Theodora. It was a thing of breathtaking, audacious power. It was not a suggestion or a pardon. It was the raw legislative might of Rome, bent and reshaped for one woman. For Theodora, watching from her small house, the proclamation was not just permission to marry, it was her first intoxicating taste of true power. Not the borrowed influence of a mistress, nor the fleeting fame of a performer, but the foundational, world-altering power of the law itself. It was a testament to a man's overwhelming desire, and she, with the cool expertise of a master artisan, recognized it for what it was, the perfect tool. She would take this raw material of his obsession and expertly channel it, hammering it into the first unassailable pillar of her own legitimacy. The path to the throne, once barred by ancient prejudice, was now paved with the ink of a new decree, and it led directly to her door. The air in the great church of the Holy Apostles was thick enough to choke on, a swirling miasma of incense, beeswax, and the cloying scent of masked humanity. Sunlight, fractured by 1,000 jeweled mosaics, fell in slanted dusty bars across the assembled might of the Eastern Roman Empire. Senators stood rigid in their silken togas, their faces carefully schooled into masks of solemnity, but their eyes were naked in their contempt. Theodora felt each scornful gaze like a physical blow, 1,000 tiny needles pricking the exposed skin of her neck and arms. They saw not an empress, but the bearkeeper's daughter, the hippodrome actress, the woman who had forced her way into their sacred world with a law that mocked their ancient privileges. Beside her, Justinian was a pillar of imperial certainty, his face a study in gravitas as the Patriarch of Constantinople raised the heavy, pearl-encrusted diadem. The weight of gold and jewels when it was settled upon her brow was a tangible, shocking pressure, but it was nothing. It was a feather compared to the crushing, invisible weight of aristocratic hatred pressing down upon her, a force more solid than the marble floor beneath her feet. She did not flinch, she did not look away. Instead, she drew herself up, her spine straightening until she seemed to grow taller, her chin lifting a fraction. The years of training on the stage did not desert her now. Her face became a serene, impassive mask, smoother and more impenetrable than any carved from ivory. The practiced stillness of the performer hid the furious, triumphant hammering of her heart. Let them stare, let them see. Their scorn was fuel for her resolve. The patriarch anointed her with holy chrism, the oil slick and fragrant on her skin, a sanctity claimed in ritual, though never granted by the men in the crowd. The choirs burst into thunderous, soaring strains of the imperial hymn, the sound vibrating through the very stones of the church. This was the pinnacle of the world, the absolute summit of power and glory in the known world, and she had not been born to it. She had clawed her way up to it from the gutter, from the dust of the arena and the humiliation of the docks, her fingers bleeding, her spirit tempered into steel in the fires of betrayal and survival. As the echoes of the hymn faded, Theodora allowed her gaze to sweep slowly across the sea of hostile, glittering faces. She had climbed and she had arrived. And as she stood there, crowned Augusta, Empress of Rome, she made herself a silent iron vow: she would never go back. Not ever. The only direction left was forward. The roar that erupted from the hippodrome was not the familiar fickle thunder of crowds cheering for chariots or pantomimes. This was deeper, uglier, a raw-throated bellow of pure, undiluted hatred. It was January 53 AD, and the city was tearing itself apart. The Nika riots, born from a spark of discontent over a botched execution, had become an inferno. The ancient rivalry between the blues and the greens, the factions that had defined Theodora's entire life, was incinerated in the heat of a shared murderous purpose. Their hatred for each other was now a forgotten luxury, replaced by a singular unifying venom directed at her and at the man she had married. From the high windows of the great palace, the world was ending in fire and fury. The air, once perfumed with orange blossoms and sea salt, was now a choking fugue of smoke and something darker, coppery and thick. The week of blood, the elegant avenues and forums were gone, replaced by a seething, chaotic river of humanity. Torches bobbed in the darkness like malevolent fireflies, and the constant rhythmic chant of the mob was a hammer blow against the palace walls. Ne'er, ne'er, they screamed, conquer. But the conquest they demanded was their own. They were not calling for victory in the games. They were screaming for the overthrow of an emperor, for the head of an empress they deemed unworthy. The palace itself had become a besieged island. The heavy bronze doors were barred. The mosaics trembled with the impact of stones and battering rams, and the polished marble floors, usually trod by silent, slippered servants, were now scuffed by the frantic boots of panicked guards. Justinian's advisors, Men whose faces were normally masks of calculated calm were pale and sweating, their voices shrill as they crowded around him. Their words were a discordant symphony of fear, each one pleading the same desperate tune. Fly. They urged him to the royal barges, to the waiting ships that could spirit them away from the certain death pounding at the gates. Their logic was the logic of survival. Their panic was a contagion that threatened to dissolve the very bonds of the world they had built, the laws they had written, the power they had wielded. All of it was moments from crumbling into ash and blood-soaked rubble, extinguished by the unified will of the murderous mob howling for their blood just beyond the shuddering door. The frantic pleas of the advisors filled the chamber, a dissonant chorus of surrender that seemed to thicken the smoke-laden air. Justinian stood amidst them, his face ashen, the weight of the crumbling world bowing his shoulder. The resolve that had built an empire, rewritten laws for a woman, seemed to be leaching from him with every crash against the palace gates. He looked toward the hidden passage that led to the sea, and in that look Theodora saw the end of everything. She did not step forward. She uncoiled. Every ounce of her being, every lesson from the gutter and the stage, every humiliation endured, every power seized, coalesced into a single, electrifying moment of stillness. The panicked men fell silent, their arguments dying in their throats as they turned to her. She was no longer just the woman they tolerated. She was the embodiment of a will they could not comprehend. Her voice, when it came, did not shout. It was the same voice that had once captivated the hippodrome, but stripped now of all artifice, honed to a blade's edge. It cut through the panic, cold and clear, each word a hammer striking an anvil. She spoke not of survival but of legacy. She spoke of the purple, the royal purple they wore, not as a garment, but as a shroud, the noblest shroud a sovereign could ever know. To flee was to live as a refugee, a ghost begging at the courts of foreign kings, forever defined by the throne they had lost. But to stand, to fight, to die here in the imperial purple, that was eternity. That was a story that would never be forgotten. Her eyes, burning with an absolute, terrifying certainty, locked with Justinian's. She was offering him a choice not between life and death, but between infamy and legend. Her unwavering courage was a contagion more potent than their fear, a stiffening agent poured into the spine of the empire itself. She would rather die an empress than flee a refugee. The choice was made. The indecision vanished from Justinian's face, replaced by a grim, ferocious clarity. The orders he barked were no longer those of a man contemplating escape, but of a commander unleashing hell. The generals Belisarius and Mundus, who had held their elite troops in tense readiness, now moved with lethal purpose. While the mob was distracted, drunk on its own fury and concentrated in the hippodrome, the soldiers executed a pincer movement, sealing the exits of the great arena. The rioters, who had moments before been chanting for a new emperor, found themselves not as conquerors but as prey trapped in a stone bowl. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. The professional soldiers of the empire fell upon the packed, undisciplined mass with ruthless efficiency. Swords rose and fell in the torchlight, a grim, mechanical harvest. The chants of Na were drowned out by screams of terror and the wet, awful sounds of butchery. The sand of the hippodrome, the very stage of Theodora's childhood, drank deep that night, its dust turning to mud under a deluge of blood. By dawn, 30,000 lay dead. The rebellion was extinguished in the most final way possible. The throne, which had trembled on the brink of annihilation, was secured not by negotiation, but by terror, and it was secured forever. Theodora had not just saved her crown, she had forged it anew in fire and blood. And from that day forward, no one would ever doubt the steel of the Empress. The silence that settled over the empire after the Nika riots was not one of peace, but of a hard-won and deeply feared stability. The blood-soaked sands of the hippodrome had been a lesson written in carnage, and Theodora, now unchallenged, began to write her own. For 2 decades, she ruled not as a consort, but as a co-regent, her will woven into the very fabric of Roman law with the same relentless precision her husband applied to his legal codes. But where his were edifices of administration, hers were monuments of mercy, forged in the memory of her own suffering. She pushed through edicts that tore young women from the grip of forced prostitution, granting them a choice she had never been given. She gave mothers rights over the children they bore, a power denied to her own mother in their most desperate hour. And throughout the city, she established sanctuaries, quiet cloisters where women who had walked the path she narrowly escaped could find refuge, spin wool, and rebuild their lives with dignity. Each law was a ghost laid to rest, a stone placed over the grave of the girl she had been. Her most visible and enduring testament, however, rose not from parchment, but from stone and mortar. She championed the rebuilding of the great church of Hagia Sophia after the riots had burned its predecessor to the ground. She poured the treasury's gold and her own formidable will into its creation, overseeing the work of architects and mathematicians who dared to dream of a dome that seemed to hang from heaven itself. When it was completed, its vast golden canopy dominated the skyline of Constantinople, a permanent fixture against the changing sky. It was more than a church, it was a statement of imperial might and divine favor, a symbol of a city and an empress that could be shattered but would always rise again, more magnificent than before. For eternity, that dome would be her silhouette against the world. The end, when it came, was not from a dagger or a mob, but from a silent, creeping enemy within. Cancer, a physician whispered, a crab-like growth that devoured her from the inside. The pain was a private humiliation, a slow unraveling of the formidable strength that had held an empire together. She faced it with the same defiance she had shown the rioters, her spirit unbowed even as her body failed. In 5048 AD, in the perfumed silence of her imperial chambers, Theodora, the bearkeeper's daughter, the actress, the empress, died. She was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, clad in the purple she had refused to relinquish, the most powerful woman the Roman world would ever know. The barefoot girl who had once begged for scraps in the hippodrome had become the empress who reshaped an empire. The woman they tried to destroy had instead destroyed every assumption about what a woman could achieve. That perhaps remains the most horrific reality of all for those who benefit from keeping others in chains. That their victims might one day discover the full extent of their own power and use it to remake the world itself. In the end, it wasn't the sexual practices that created the emperor. It was the empress who took those experiences and forged them into a crown that blazed brighter than any jewel in the imperial treasury. The rest, as they say, is history.